Hello, welcome back everyone. In this session, we're going to be talking about how to make diversity, inclusion, and equity a priority and practice in the workplace. Let's jump into this session, and we're going to be joined by Kristen Anderson, Chief Diversity Officer at Barilla Group, Eswin Boyson, Chief HR Officer into Food, Chuck Stevens, Global Head of Inclusion, Diversity and Belonging at Booking.com, Sabina Khanum, Head of Inclusion at Viva, and last but not least, James Page, Chief Inclusion, Diversity, Equity Officer at General Assembly. How is everyone?
Good.
Yeah. Again, we've done all of these sessions, but you never know who's going to say hello first.
Who's going to go first? Yeah.
How is everyone? There we go. First of all, I'd say I said it to you before the call, but Kristen, you have the coolest background and location of the day, I have to say, because I thought that was a green screen behind you, and it's pretty incredible. Tell us more.
No, I'm Barilla. You probably might be familiar with. It's a family-owned company, pasta, but also bakery products in Parma. So I'm located in Parma, Italy, and this is my apartment. It's in a 15th century building that we've been renovating. And as American, when we don't have so many old things, this is kind of our passion.
Amazing. I just couldn't take my eyes off it when I was looking. I was like, that's so cool. But before we jump in, thank you first and foremost for all of you being here. And one of the things I do love about doing this virtually, and the topic obviously is diversity and inclusion, is actually being able to have people tune in from all over the world within your field to different thoughts, insights, background for different cultures. As well, something we typically don't get to do face to face, because you either have the local community, the local leaders, but the fact we've got people from South Africa, from North America, from Europe, from all over the world, there's something about that that gets me super excited as well. And I know, James, there's something I think you mentioned to Shane on the pre-call, is that having such a diverse range of panelists also adds to the richness of the discussion and conversation. So super excited about this. I'm going to pick on Chuck first, because he didn't know that, but I'm picking on him first anyway. Chuck, what's worked and helped your organization build community and action during these sort of challenging times over the past few months?
Hey, Chris. Well, thanks, and greetings to everyone from Amsterdam. There's a couple of things we've done that in hindsight worked out really well. One, we had launched a group we call Be Inclusionist, and it was really to reach out to the people that are in the organization to help find the willing folks, those agents of change that wanted to go through and be part of the solution, and how do we upskill them. So we had gone through and created Be Inclusionist, and think of it as an employee resource group that doesn't have meetings. It's open to any employee. And we've had a critical mass of our employees that have come together saying, hey, I'm an agent of change around diversity and I want to learn more. And we've empowered them to go through and do things on their own to have positive impact. More recently, relative to COVID, we're in over 200 markets around the world, and trying to create a sense of community in the middle of lockdown when most of our offices have gone to being work from home, was we empowered our employee resource groups to go through, or our colleagues to come up with solutions. So for example, Be Bold, our Black employee network, went through and has done a global DJ concert that happened around the world over 24 hours. They do connection cafes, and we use the functionality within our video conferencing to break people into small groups and talk about both where they are relative to the Black Lives Matter movement or racism around the world, but how do they go through and just create that sense of community? And just kind of really built on that. How can we be kind of scrappy and innovative that allows people to find that sense of home, because everybody's missing that connectivity right now, and being able to go through and do anything and everything we can so it's not just business, but to really provide that infrastructure and kind of friendship and colleague support.
Fantastic. And feel free for everyone to jump in. Don't wait for me. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing, Kristen.
Yeah, just to add on to so first of all, thanks for the invitation here. It's nice to be here. What Chuck was saying, we've used our existing employee resource groups to basically enable that authentic and safe space for people to talk about their issues that they're facing during COVID. And we're still facing, I'm in Italy, you probably see the cases are rising. And so there's a lot of worry and concern. So we're using those to continually have, as Chuck said, those conversations. And also as a forum to talk about the new way of working and how we can be more inclusive in the new space. So we're bringing outside speakers to talk about how do you be more inclusive virtually? How do you make sure you don't forget the people that maybe are virtual when you're occasionally in the office? So, and it's amazing how many people want to now spend time being more inclusive. It's generate a lot of participation.
Chris, this is a really unique opportunity for organizations to look at kind of what's happening as the glass half full versus half empty. I'm connecting with colleagues, like we said earlier, around the globe on a daily basis, holding office hours for people who are in Europe, people who are in California, followed by someone in New York. And what I love about what's happening right now is that no one is excluded. So it's not like you've got a group of people who are privileged to be in the home office and everyone else feels like they don't belong. But right now, everyone's on an even playing field. So when we talk about making, leaning into what's happening right now, I think organizations have a very important and unique opportunity to engage with people in ways that you just couldn't do, that doesn't require a 12-hour plane trip so that you feel that you're part of the in group. So while there are some real challenges that are happening right now, I think that smart, innovative organizations are using this to their advantage and creating more inclusion than they had even when we were in person.
Mm-hmm. What are some, go for it.
Oh, Chris, no, I was just going to say what you were saying earlier, Chris, about being mindful around who's speaking when you're having phone calls and trying to kind of pass the mic around. And sometimes when you have team meetings and there's 40 people on the screen, it's hard to know who's saying what. And I think some of the things that we're working for at Viva is around the kind of, when we're working from home, the accessibility and making sure that the accessibility needs that people had within the workplace, that they have the same needs when they're home and they have the same equipment that they had access to when they're in the workplace as well. Some of the things we're trying to do is around mental health and making sure that people have access to wellbeing services as well. And there's been an increase naturally of those services in our different kind of countries. But really, it is just thinking, well, actually, it's not everybody has the same accessibility to space, and have lots of people share really, really tiny flats. So really thinking and being mindful around the space that they have. So not everybody wants to be on camera. Maybe they want, are not feeling comfortable about the area they're working in. So just being really kind of more thoughtful around what that inclusion is going to look like, and hearing everybody's voice as well a bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Sabina. I think one thing that I would add to just what Sabina mentioned and the rest of the panelists is that we actually have, with the whole COVID pandemic that's hit us globally, is that we have this one united focus, and that's there's a lot of power in that, because that actually sets the framework for how we can address all of our differences, and how we address that through the commonality of what we face, because we're all looking to survive COVID as an example, and through that we have, through our shared experiences, although we come from diverse backgrounds and diverse realities, how do we measure up against this challenge that we face? And through that, the learnings that we are picking up from that now within our business is that if we can face those challenges, some of these others are it's not nearly as life and death. So how do we make sure we set the right platform to have that open discussions, have that open engagement, and allow everyone into that platform to find the solutions for challenges that we might have in the D&I space? Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to know, Sabina, from your perspective as well, what is your organization doing to work towards sort of the racial equity, and how can you engage meaningfully, I think is the main word I want to put across, in anti-racism and allyship?
Yeah, so I think we made race a priority last year, and I think with the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement across the globe over the summer has really kind of progressed the work in this area. We have talked to lots of different colleagues within Aviva, worked with our different employee resource groups. We did a lot of listening for 3 months, and we're continuing to do that and realise that that's going to be ongoing, and lots of staff from different levels have been coming together to have really kind of uncomfortable conversations, but working through them and really kind of talking through what it means. There's lots of different concepts around talking about whiteness and white privilege, talking about white fragility. I mean, it's excelled. I was actually on parental leave for 6 months whilst everything was happening. And when I came back, I was completely kind of taken back by how kind of progressive some of the conversations have been happening within Aviva, and how many people were engaged in this. And so at Aviva, we recognise that we have a long way to go. We have launched our kind of Black Action Plan, and in there we talk about supporting colleagues, educating our colleagues around what anti-racism is and how you can start the conversations and think about what your role is. Not really, moving beyond being an ally. How do you become an advocate and an activist, and how do you actually talk about, the hierarchy of race and where you sit within that and what privilege looks like? And how can you then use that to be able to change things within the organization and wider society as well? So we're working in the whole kind of education piece with all of our employees, and also not just employees, talking to us kind of supply chains and some of our clients as well. So working through on that. But we haven't, we realize that we've got a long way to go. We don't have enough, data to really kind of talk about, really kind of evidence-based work yet, but that's what we're working towards. But just even the conversations that we're having and how we're moving things forward and really kind of listening to people and moving the organisation. But it's going to take a lot of work, and I'm really keen to see what other colleagues on the panel have been doing and as well.
I think that's a fascinating one. And Sabine, I know you're in London, and, here in Amsterdam, the need around data collection is something that I see is evolving very quickly. And there's a tension between privacy, particularly from kind of an EU perspective, versus the norms we see in the US. And how do we actually go through and figure out a way to be able to look at differences in experience, be it for customers or colleagues, around progression, access to systems, those sorts of things, whenever it's much more difficult for us to collect that information outside of a US or even a UK model. But it's critical to evolve it. And so, that's an area that I'm really passionate about, is how we go through and start to understand the experience. Because I hear a lot of people in Europe thinking that this is just a US issue. And yet any person that I talk to that looks different than me talks about the racism they run into on a regular basis, not daily. And every Asian person I know, due to COVID, has talked about the racism or prejudice they ran into, because somehow them being Asian meant that they were going to get infected by COVID from that colleague or friend.
Well, Chuck, if I can add on to what you were saying, I think it's really taking the conversation to Europe. I mean, again, we're more than half of our 8,000 employees are in Italy. And it's what you said, Chuck, that people perceive this as a Black Lives Matter, is that there's racism in the US, and it's a terrible tragedy with the murder of George Floyd, but this is not an issue that we need to address in Europe. So we need to take that to the senior leaders. And we've started 2 weeks ago to have a conversation about racism, how to be not racist, but to be an anti-racist in Europe. What is the context of racism in the major countries in which we operate? So Italy, France, Germany, the Nordics, is important for us. And, engaging the regional presidents who have stories, so especially ones that don't look like me, have stories of discrimination and racism against them, and taking that to their teams. So we've got to start at the top. It's got to be listening conversations, but they have to get engaged from the senior leadership, and that's what we're doing now.
James, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is a tough one, because right now what we need to understand is that people are in pain. People are in a lot of pain, and it's not just the idea of how do you create a culturally anti-racist organization, because that is difficult. An anti-racist organization means that you've got an organization that people are actively not sitting in the sidelines. They are getting engaged. They understand their privilege, and they also understand how to be culturally humble when they're talking about subjects that are so painful. And let's be real about what's going on right now. This is not something that happened with George Floyd or Trayvon Martin. This has been going on in the United States for hundreds of years. The only thing that's happening right now is that we have a lot of these things right here that allow us to capture what's happening. So what's going on is not a new phenomenon. We have to understand that people have been dealing with this pain for a very long time. What's happening is that we're seeing a bubbling up. Now, one of the things that I love about this moment that we're seeing, my son and I were in LaGrange, Kentucky, which is not a heavily diverse part of the United States. And there was a Black Lives Matter protest that was taking place in LaGrange, Kentucky. There had to be about 500 people at the protest. And we may have seen 5 individuals who were not white holding up signs. And that's one of the things I love about what's happening right now, that this movement that we're seeing is not strictly a movement of Black or brown voices. This is a movement of all voices coming together, united in what they're saying that is not right. The wrongs that are happening around the country. So I think we really have to understand that that being an anti-racist organization is going to be difficult. It's going to take a large amount of time, but we're in this together and we are making a difference.
What are some practical things that we can do to help these conversations? They are uncomfortable conversations, but what are some of the work that you're doing with your leaders in your organizations to help them have these conversations? Because I'll tell you a story which I'm not proud of, but I'm happy to be vulnerable. My wife's Black, and when this all happened, I was sitting there saying to myself, do I say something? Do I not? Do I post about it? Do I not? I don't want to say something in case it comes across the wrong way. Who cares about my opinion? Who cares about my opinion? And my wife came to me and she said, I'm a bit disappointed that you didn't post something to show your support, and it really hit me in the heart, because I had something written up that I wanted to post, but I was like, who cares about Chris's opinion on this? And that is exactly the problem. I did a post on LinkedIn, the video which many people saw, actually 10,000 people saw, and it was like me being very vulnerable, saying this is my experience, this is what my thoughts. I don't understand, but I'm here. I'm willing to listen, and I'm willing to learn. And I think that was tough to do that. And that's from a white male who's grown up in a multicultural environment and is married to a Black woman. So I know a lot of leaders are just afraid of saying the wrong thing. So what can we do? What are some practical things? Or I'm wondering, how are you doing it in your organization to support your leaders that are maybe afraid to speak up or say the wrong thing?
I think some of the work that my colleagues have been doing with team discussions and having safe spaces to discuss what it means and talking about race really kind of in an open way, doing lots of kind of work around what privilege looks like, what whiteness is. I think one of the problem around race and racism is white is never labeled as a race, and whiteness isn't really spoken about. So really kind of talking about that. I know that we have a Black Action Plan. One of my professors said, well, why are we asking that question if we know it's systematic racism? Shouldn't we have a white action plan instead? And so it's just recognizing what people's roles are when racism is happening and how you can help. I think often people get really scared about saying the wrong word or describing a group of ethnic minorities using different language and upsetting people. But I think it's even more damaging when you don't say something or don't talk about it. I think talking about it, being uncomfortable, being okay with being uncomfortable, and really kind of listening to people's lived experiences without feeling like fragile about it and thinking that it's personal about you, but really kind of listening to people's lived experiences and working through that. And so that's some of the work that we've been doing with our senior leaders as well. We are going to start doing reverse mentorship with our senior leaders so that they can hear it firsthand from people who work at Aviva and what it's like. And again, we're not trying to get people to relive their trauma, and it's only if people feel comfortable wanting to do it, and it's optional for people, just so that people can, senior leaders can really understand what it's like firsthand from people as well as ongoing kind of discussions and safe spaces, and my team being able to help coach people as well.
Yeah. Can Sabina, I really like what you just said. I'm going to push back just a little bit, if you don't mind, with what you said. And that's this idea of creating safe spaces. I really don't necessarily think we're in a place right now where we can say we're going to create safe spaces, because these are very difficult conversations. And when I'm having these conversations with individuals, I start off and say that we're not going to be able to create a safe space. What we're going to be able to do is create brave and courageous spaces built on the foundations of dignity and respect, because safeness means that people may not be challenged. They may not be uncomfortable. And a lot of these conversations that we're talking about in this moment are uncomfortable. They are going to make people feel challenged in ways they haven't before. We're talking about religion, sexual orientation, gender ID, politics, all these things your parents told you never to talk about at work. These are probably some of the most popular non-work topics that we're discussing right now. So I think it's really important that we do lay a foundation that this may not feel safe. It will be done with dignity and respect, and it is going to be done in a way that we're going to be brave and courageous. The final thing I'd say is there are 5 steps that I give people, organizations that are looking to have these conversations. The first is make sure you have clear actions on what you're going to do. The second, what are your commitments? What are you committing to? What are your transparent policies? Are you reevaluating what you're doing? Because some of the things you're doing, you may need to stop. And finally, how are you retooling the organization so that you can be successful? And then when we start to talk about the traps to avoid, there are 5 traps that I give organizations to avoid who are looking to have these important conversations. First is inaction. You kind of talked about that, Chris. Recycling, taking the COVID-19 topics and just labeling Black Lives Matter right on top of it. Silence, not saying anything at all. Hypocrisy. The NFL did a great job of this when they decided they were all for Black Lives Matter after they crushed Colin Kaepernick's career. And then finally, a completely detached, unreality approach.
Great steps there. Could you repeat those previous 5 steps? I didn't catch them. Before you said 2 lots of 5 steps. The first 5 steps you mentioned. Could you just repeat them one time?
The things that organizations that are doing this work right and having these conversations, clear actions, the commitments, transparent commitments, bold policies. They're reevaluating what they're currently doing to make sure it's still aligned and appropriate, and they're retooling their leaders so that the leaders are appropriately skilled to lean into the work that's happening today and not necessarily what was happening last year.
Thanks, James. I appreciate that. It was a lot of great value to take in, so I just wanted to make sure as well. Any other thoughts on that? I saw Eswin. I saw you.
I wanted to actually, and James covered some of that elements where we live in a period where silence is also a message that's been carried, and we need to create the space. I think that's perhaps where Sabina says, when she talked about safe space, we need to create the space for people's voices to be heard, right? And in the dynamic in the South African context, which is kind of flipped around, where the majority has been oppressed and is struggling with challenges in terms of diversity and inclusion in the workspace and in society as general. There's a lot of ignorance that still exists around what is diversity, what is inclusion, what is Black Lives Matter, and it gets countered by all lives matter. So how do we bring these messages and create those spaces that we can communicate in our workspaces, because that's where we combine, and all our different cultures and opinions and beliefs merge. How do we create that space where we can have these conversations, right? And chart the right outcomes in terms of where we want to go, what we want to create out of it, and what we want to achieve as the ultimate outcome. Outside of the structure that's put in place by all of our different opinions and viewpoints and so forth, and being censored in a way. It is a tough discussion that we need to have, and we need to be the voices of that. Now, each of us has to take it forward and be the voice in our way to bring across what we see the future for us to be.
Does anyone want to jump in? Anyone want to add any more to that? No? I'm interested to hear your thoughts. We've seen, and I'm sure we've seen like 100%, I'm sure it's more, increase in the number of chief DE&I officers that are being appointed over the past few months, year. How do we ensure that they have the right resources to succeed in these organizations, especially in terms of changing cultures, mindsets, habits that have been ingrained in these organizations? Because from what I'm seeing from the outside in is I see D&I executives going in, they're leaving just as fast as they're going in the door. Is this a trend that you're all seeing? Because it's something I'm seeing, that they're perhaps going into organizations, but the culture itself isn't inclusive and they leave just as fast. So I'm wondering, how do we set those leaders up for success?
Maybe, sorry, Chris, maybe if I jump in first, because I know all of the other panelists, have D&I inclusion officers in part. And in our organization, we do not have a specific role for a diversity and inclusion officer, which in a pragmatic way is almost about half of the challenge, is because diversity and inclusion doesn't sit in a role or the title, right? And I think that's where a lot of that pushback comes from when we talk transformation, we talk diversity and inclusion, but it's avoid, or it's seen apart from what we are actually as a business in terms of where we want to be as a business, our vision, strategies, and especially the practices, the policies, and the systems that's intact. And then it's almost seen as a counterbalance of either or. Who do we become from who we are? And I think it's important as part of the diversity and inclusion agenda that it's seen as something that's driven through the business, through how we do things around here, right? How is it important that we bring that together and have the ownership and sponsorship from the top table, right? And how that filters down into the rest of the business, and that creates then the environment where the diversity and inclusion conversations can be held, and then the roles and structures can be supported from.
That's a good point, Ashwin.
Could I add on just a comment really quickly about something practical that we did when we started the D&I work 7 years ago, Barilla? So to not have D&I perceived as something that's only HR driven, D&I is a separate group, and I report to the CEO. All of us, including me, have other jobs in the business, because we wanted to be very clear that this is not a separate group that manages to become more inclusive. It needs to be managed as part of the business. And our D&I board and our committee members from around the world all have other jobs. So they have a partial hat of D&I and a more major hat of marketing or HR or supply chain sales, etc. So they're the ones responsible for embedding it not only in the geographies but also in their functions. And so that in that way, it's not perceived, hopefully, in the organization as something that Kristen Anderson is leading off to the side, and I don't have to get involved.
Hey, Chris, there's one of the folks I looked up to is Roz Hudnall, that used to lead diversity for Intel and their foundation. And she said, diversity and inclusion isn't rocket science, it's harder. We're being asked to solve a problem that society has never been able to address. And this idea that somehow we're going to fix the diversity problem is fiction. The human experience isn't static, it changes over time. And so to think that somehow diversity is something we're going to resolve in 5 or 10 years, the power dynamics are constantly shifting, and so we're never going to be done with it. But I completely agree with everyone that this is not an HR problem; it's a business issue. But we also have to think about what we're doing for our colleagues, and that's the context I normally hear this talked about in. We have to think about how we embed this in our entire supply chain and who our partners are, and then we need to think about what the relevance is for our end customers. And so if you're not willing to think about it in those 3 regards and take an incredibly long-term plan, you are doomed for failure, and your talent's going to move through. And that's true for your talent within your organization, your customers, or frankly, your CDO.
I'll just jump in really quick on this one as well. As we look at diversity and what diversity can do to organizations, you go back to Chrysler and how diversity saved Chrysler when the women's group decided to come up with minivans. You look at Frito-Lay when Frito-Lay introduced the guacamole flavored potato chips, and it brought in over $50 million in the first year. You look at the company I used to work with at Dell, and how Dell was the first company to introduce fashionable computer bags, which brought in $20 million in the first year. You look at some of the work that I've done within Cincinnati Children's, Johns Hopkins, where we literally are saving lives and creating capacity for organizations due to cultural competency being introduced as a vital skill set. Now, here's where I have a challenge. If an organization can't put real resources around diversity and inclusion, I have a feeling that they need to stop wasting people's time and get real about the work. We would never put a CHRO, a CFO, a COO, a chief legal officer, any other leader in a position to say you're going to shift the culture of the organization by yourself. We would never do that to any other senior leader and expect them to shift the results across the organization. In addition to that, we would never tell these same senior leaders that after you've been extremely successful, we expect you to work yourself out of a job. If a CEO does a fabulous job and doubles the goals of the organization, we're going to give that CEO more resources. If the CFO doubles the financial of the organization, we're not going to say, okay, we don't need a CFO anymore because we've doubled our finances. We would never say to a legal person, if they drop the legal cases by 70%, we don't need a legal person anymore. But we would look at a diversity officer square in the face and say, my goal is to have you work yourself out of a job by 5 years. We have been dealing with this issue in America, at least for 300 and some years. And to say in 5 years, we're going to fix this problem and work ourselves out of a job is not only delusional, it's somewhat dangerous in my opinion.
Yeah. So much to take away from what you just said there, James. I don't even know where to start. I'll relate it just on your point about the innovation and product side to my own company. Our industry in the event space disappeared overnight a few months when COVID hit. So more than 80% of our revenue disappeared in one day when lockdown hit because we had to cancel all of our events globally. And when people ask me, how are you still, 99% of the events companies are gone, which is our core revenue stream. How did you survive, Chris? How are you and the team thriving? And my answer was because of my team and a diversity of thought and perspective that they brought to the table and innovative ideas. Because I didn't have the answers. The team looked at me and said, Chris, what are we going to do? I was like, I don't know. We're going to come together and figure this out. And all of the kind of ideas, innovations, and products we've built came from that group of diverse, peers, and not diversity of just because of their skin color, but also the diversity of thought as well that came to the table. So that's just my kind of bit. And I wouldn't be here right now with all of you and 1,000 people listening right now if it wasn't for the team to be able to do that as well. So that really hit me in the face a few months ago when I realized, wow, without that, we wouldn't be here as a business as well. But I still want to go back to the original question, which I feel like we still haven't answered, which is kind of how do we then support those DE&I leaders when they come into the business? What are some of the things we can do to help support them?
I think we need to make sure they're properly educated. We take people from every industry, every walk of life, and we decide
a lot of wind, James, on your headset.
Sorry about that. We take people from every walk of life, every part of the business, and decide that they are a diversity leader. We will take someone from manufacturing who's Black and decide, okay, you can be the diversity leader. Again, we would not do that with any other skill-based leader across the organization. So we're taking people who have different levels of skill and we're putting them in these positions. What we have to do is make sure that there's a base level of competence of how to do this work, that they understand what success looks like, how to create the metrics, how to create alignment, how to get the board engaged, how to lean into supplier and also the community side of this. We have to make sure that they, first of all, know what they're doing, and second of all, can create a clear plan on why they need the resources necessary to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'll be honest, offline, outside of this show and the podcast I do, I speak to some of your D&I peers and I ask them that same question and they say, Chris, I was given a role and told to figure it out. Like literally, I was just given a role, you just figure it out. And they're just left to their own devices. And then and without much support, guidance, investment, and we wonder why it either fails or they leave just as fast as they join. And I'm just seeing that far too often.
And I think, Chris, it also comes down to having strong leadership commitment in the company, not just to have, the title for having someone.
Not just ticking the box.
Yeah, ticking the box, because if you don't have a strong leader that's supporting you, and I agree with James immediately that the education and the training is important, but having more than one leader, having leaders at different levels who can be your kind of co-champions, to help push and drive the agenda. Without that, it's, as you said, it's a tick the box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you were to sit down, James, with a group of your peers, other DE&I executives, what's the one question you want to ask them all?
Wow, that's a great question. My engineering background would make me probably have a metrics-driven type question. This idea of what's that one, I don't know if y'all saw that movie with Dan, I don't know, where he said, what's the one thing? It's this idea of what's that one thing, that one metric that you can point to as really the indicator of your success that you can champion across the organization. I don't know what it is yet. I've got a lot of them, but what's that one? That one thing that really helps you from a quantitative standpoint show your success.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, from my experience, that's probably the hardest question to ask and most difficult. Does anyone want to be brave enough to answer that question?
I would say, I think we got to stop admiring the problem. Said the American living in Europe, we like to think that this is a U.S. issue around race, and it's only been around for 300 years. Anything we see happening in the U.S. is happening globally. We can look at Black communities in Africa and around the world. We can look around Asian communities in Asia around the world. And there's systematic racism that exists within the community about the lightness or darkness of skin. There's internalized homophobia within the LGBT community that I'm part of. There's misogyny that exists within gender on both sides of the equation. But I think we've got to go through and look at this to figure out how we balance it and be able to say it's not a problem over there, but it resides within me.
Yeah. Interesting. I love that, because something that always just stuck with me is, and one of your peers said many years ago, is like, we all carry around our backpack of beliefs. And as we go on our journey, we kind of fill that backpack of beliefs based on our circumstances, backgrounds, and experiences. And that's different for everyone.
Yep.
And it's, inherently we're unconscious bias, right? We're all biased. We all have biases as well.
But sometimes, Chris, it is conscious. I think we often say that everything's unconscious, but it's not. Sometimes it is conscious.
100%.
Excluding people.
Yeah,
so it's just trying to figure out which one's happening at that time. Right?
It's super difficult. I'm conscious of time because I'm being told off again by Ivan, my producer, as always, for being late. If there was one, many of you, I know some of you knew kind of early in this journey, and some of you got more experience. But if you had to kind of give one piece of advice to someone who's perhaps leading a D&I function, or not even just a D&I function, leaders around the world, because this shouldn't be a D&I function issue, this should be a business issue. What advice would you give? There's one piece of advice you give to those leaders. What would that be? I'm going to start with yourself, Chuck.
I tell you, one of the things I've always loved about diversity and inclusion, it's like open source software. This group can call in each other and will call in each other and share information, because I think collectively we believe that high tides lift all boats. And, to James's point, there's no set, you do 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to fix this. But, I've seen industries come together to work across competitive lines to improve the world. There's a shortage of tech talent, and we work across tech industries on a regular basis to try and promote gender, balance in STEM, for example. So leverage your network and don't be shy about talking what your challenges are.
Mm-hmm. Eswin?
Yeah, I think the one thing is, we have to realize that D&I is a hard science. It's not a soft science. And maybe to James's, in the engineering background, like the old mantra is what measured gets done. And we have to fulfill that in terms of it's a hard science that we have to pursue and put the right resources and create a fertile ground before we go all digging it and kumbaya around what we see this to be, right? And bring that reality across. And probably something that I want to leave everyone with is just a African statement, a Zulu statement that you probably heard quite a bit. That's Ubuntu, which says, I am because you are, right? And what that basically says is that before I look at myself and take my backpack and pour it out on you, is allow your views, your expressions, and your reality to to assimilate so that we can create that pathway forward together. And I think that's something that I always come back to in simplicity around this, to make sure that we drive the right culture, values, and beliefs, from an organizational point of view. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks. Sabina?
So I think as a psychologist and being in this field for about 10 years and working with different people, I think being around D&I leaders as well, I just think about having humility and really kind of taking the time to listen to people and grow and self-reflect yourself, I think is really important. As the inclusion experts, we're learning all the time. Every person has a different story. And like you said, we put our assumptions on them, but we should try and listen to what the person's saying rather than making up our mind about them, and kind of really taking that time to do that and reflect as much as possible inward and outwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kristen?
So as another engineer,
there's a lot of engineers.
We're engineers in the D&I space. No, I go down to like just the one thing. I would tell every leader at the company, you get engaged in some way, shape, or form with D&I. It's not a spectator sport. So it's not something you just watch everyone else do something. And, it's one of our D&I board members that we have external experts. She said it very clearly. She said, you got to get leaders to get engaged, even telling them to fake it, until they feel it. If they stay outside, not getting engaged, they're never going to feel it. What Sabina said, they're never going to feel the experiences of others. So you need to push them, even if they feel uncomfortable, to get engaged, to kind of fake it until they really start having those powerful stories to share. And then I think that's when things will start moving.
Mm-hmm. And James, wrap it up for us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I love this question. I'm asked this a lot when I'm working with organizations through consulting. Here's what I would say. I'm now adding to my my engineering hat, my MBA hat, and my question is this: what is your organization in the business of doing? No matter what business you're in, if you're in the business of healthcare, education, food, manufacturing, what are you in the business of doing? And how is D&I focus going to help make your business more successful? And how are you going to help implement that across your organization? Because ultimately, organizations are in the business of doing something well. And as a D&I leader, you have to support that bottom line.
Incredible. Wow, so much to unpack there and take in. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us, and thank you to all of you, Kristen, Chuck, Eswin, Sabine, James. It's a real pleasure